Let's get to the Clinton team reaction to this email report from the State Department Inspector General and what's being said about it. Brian Fallon is press secretary for the Clinton campaign. He joins us from New York. Brian, thanks for being here.
Hi, Brett.
I wanted to get right into it. Secretary Clinton numerous times has talked about why she had the private email, the private server, and that it was approved. Here's what she said, and she said it more times than just this.
My personal email use was fully above board. It was allowed by the State Department, as they have confirmed. The truth is, everything I did was permitted, and I went above and beyond what anybody could have expected in making sure that if the State Department didn't capture something, I made a real effort to get it to them. And I had no obligation to do any of that.
As you know, the Inspector General's report says something completely different. The Inspector General found no evidence that the Secretary, it says, requested or obtained guidance or approval to conduct official business via personal account on her private server. According to the current CIO and Assistant Secretary for Diplomatic Security, Secretary Clinton had an obligation to discuss using her personal email account to conduct official business with their offices, who in turn would have attempted to provide her with approved or secured means that met their business needs. However, according to these officials, DS and IRM did not and would not approve her exclusive reliance on a personal email account to conduct department business because of the restrictions in the FAM and the security risks in doing so. What about that, Brian?
Well, I think if you look at the statements that the Secretary has made that you played, the point that she's making is that if you look at the regulations that were in place at the time, they did not bar folks at the State Department from using personal email for work purposes. In fact, the report today by the IG found that some 90-plus different top-level officials in the State Department, dating back to the Bush administration, used personal email for work purposes, including Secretary Powell, including Secretary Kerry, who followed Secretary Clinton. So there was a clear precedent set that it was acceptable to use personal email for work purposes.
Sure, there's an email.
I think that's what the Secretary has long been referring to.
There's the email, and then there's the personal server in her house,
right.
Neither of which were approved according to the State Department IG, and they wouldn't have been approved according to this statement based on security concerns.
So this report is looking at two different implications of her use of personal email. First is, did it violate any federal records rules in terms of preserving government records? And there, it's sort of immaterial that she had a personal server because the requirement from a federal records keeping standpoint is, are you preserving the records, and then are you filing them or turning them over to the State Department? And she did that. With respect to the second consideration that was assessed in the State Department IG report today, which was the matter of security, was there a security risk posed by her use of a server, personal server, to host her personal email account? And what the section of that report said today was that there was no evidence that this personal server of hers was ever breached successfully.
Well,
there were
hold on about that.
There were attempted intrusions, but none of them were successful. And
well,
that
you don't
matches
know that.
all the.
How do you know that?
Well, there has been reporting out of the ongoing Justice Department review that they've looked at the logs, the security logs for that server, and found no evidence of that.
So this hacker Guccifer, you don't buy that he got into the server?
Actually, we don't, and there's no evidence to corroborate that.
Why do you think the Justice Department has cut him a deal?
Well, he's been extradited to the United States to face charges related to his confirmed hacking of other individuals,
including Sidney Blumenthal, who had emails from Secretary Clinton.
Former President Bush, including the sister of former President Bush, Sidney Blumenthal, and others who he successfully performed hacks on.
Okay.
Right, but he is not facing any charges related to any activities related to Secretary Clinton.
You mentioned
and
the
there
security.
Was reporting.
She said that there were no security breaches. In Audit 3 of this report, January 9, 2011, non-departmental advisor to President Obama, who provided technical support to the Clinton email system, notified the Secretary's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations that he had to shut down the server because he believed, quote, someone was trying to hack us, and while they did did not get in. I didn't want to let them have the chance to. Later that day, the advisor again wrote to the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, "We were attacked again, so I shut the server down for a few minutes." On January 10th, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations emailed the Chief of Staff and Deputy Chief of Staff for Planning and instructed them not to email the Secretary anything sensitive and stated that she could explain more in person. It seems like there were security concerns, and a couple of IT people were told to not talk about the email practices of the Secretary ever again. Never speak of the Secretary's personal email server or system ever again.
So there's a couple issues there, Brett. Let me quickly unpack them. First, with respect to those incidents that were reported, what I think it shows is that appropriate precautions and security standards were maintained in terms of guarding that private server that housed her personal account. You have two instances there where there were reports of attempted intrusions, and that's not new. We've seen in reports over the last few months, it's been documented that there were various phishing attempts and other attempted intrusions. The point is none of them were successful as compared, say, to the actual State Department email system, which we know was breached.
By the way, this IT guy in this is Brian Pagliano, who has also been given a deal by the Justice Department.
Well, that's true. I mean, but I don't know why he sought immunity, and we actually encouraged him to participate without immunity because we don't think he has anything to hide.
Why didn't the Secretary participate in this IG report? Why didn't she sit down for an interview when Secretaries Kerry, Albright, Powell, and Rice all sat down for interviews with the IG?
Well, there's a multitude of entities that are investigating this email issue right now, and Hillary Clinton has answered a lot of questions about it, dating back to...
But not to this IG.
That's correct, but if you want to ask whether she's shirking questions or trying to avoid having to answer hard questions about why she made this decision, I don't think that that criticism is warranted, given that she sat before a Republican-led oversight committee that was drilling down on this issue. She has volunteered to sit before the Justice Department if they ask her.
Steve Linick was appointed by President Obama in 2013. I heard you on another channel earlier today suggest that there is some kind of anti-Clinton bias with this Inspector General, an Inspector General appointed by President Obama?
Well, there were reports a few months back suggesting, affirming the fact that one of the top individuals in that office, the #2 official in that office, had a connection, had formerly worked for Senator Grassley, who, of course, has been one of Secretary Clinton's chief antagonists on this issue. And so there were calls from various members of Congress for that official to at least recuse herself from this matter. That didn't happen.
Well, you're not suggesting this report is somehow flawed because of that tenuous connection on the #2 person in that?
Well, I think one can raise questions about whether someone should have recused himself and still assess the report on its merits. And I think that many of the findings in this report actually corroborate what Secretary Clinton has long said. And in terms of the actual recommendations that this report makes in terms of how the State Department could improve its record-keeping systems, we've said today that if Secretary Clinton were still in charge of the State Department, she'd be accepting those recommendations.
You know, she's said numerous times, Brian, that she has turned everything over, every single thing. The State Department said today that's not the case. The report itself said there were things that were not turned over right away. And in fact, one of the emails that did not come out publicly in the tranches that were given to reporters was one that said, in November 2010, Secretary Clinton and her Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations discussed the fact that Secretary Clinton's emails to department employees were not being received. The Deputy Chief of Staff emailed the Secretary that, quote, "We should talk about putting you on state email or releasing your email address to the department so you're not going to spam." In response, the Secretary wrote, "Let's get separate address or device, but I don't want any risk of the personal being accessible." That was never released to reporters.
Right. So from time to time, there have been reports over the last few months of instances where materials that she turned over didn't match materials that other folks that worked in the State Department turned over. There were an incidental amount of emails that didn't appear in both batches. There have been known instances, for instance, the first 2 months where she started off as Secretary of State, where she was not yet on the server. And so when she went to retrieve the emails to provide them to the State Department last year, they weren't on the server in the first place, so she couldn't turn them over. She has turned over, what she has always said is she's turned over everything that she had, which constituted 55,000 pages, which is 55,000 pages more than anyone else, including other secretaries that used personal email, ever turned over to the State Department.
Yeah, no other secretary had a personal server. We should make that clear, as we've made it clear on the first part. But here's the question.
From a record-keeping perspective, though, Brett, that question is beside the point. You can retain the records whether your email system is on a server or through Gmail.
Well, sure, but you're also dealing with 2,100 classified emails that you all say were classified after the fact. I mean, they weren't marked. It really doesn't matter. Right. The issue is the server. It was on the server. So handling classified material is another investigation, but one in which we'll see what happens with the FBI.
Well, but there, too, the same issue applies with Secretary Powell, where emails that he sent on his personal account have been judged after the fact, retroactively, to contain information that they think was sensitive. Secretary Powell reacted quite forcefully to that and suggested it was absurd in terms of the type of material that they were considering now classified. And so I'm not suggesting in invoking Secretary Powell that he did anything wrong back at the time when he was using personal email. But I think the fact that it's so widely applicable, this criticism that's been made of Secretary Clinton, it shows that it's really just a matter of different agencies, in this case intelligence agencies, taking one standard when the State Department is very customized to using another.
Obviously, a lot of people on Capitol Hill look at that differently. Brian, we really appreciate your time tonight, and we'd love to have you back.
Thank you, Brett. I really appreciate you having me on.